This is what happens when you try to build a single, reliable timeline for the world of Runeterra out of the scattered records, legends, and contradictions that Riot Games has published across more than a decade of stories. The short answer is that Runeterra does have a timeline, though it is not the clean, dated ledger that word usually brings to mind, and understanding why is the whole point of tonight. Before we get into the itty-bitty of it, I have a confession. I need you to, how do I say it? I would appreciate it if you what I mean is, subscribe. Runeterra is the world where League of Legends takes place, a single planet holding dozens of nations, oceans, buried empires, and forgotten ages. For a world this large, you would expect a calendar. You would expect a first year, a set of centuries counted forward in order, and a tidy sequence of events that historians could point to without argument. What you find instead is something stranger, and in its own way far more believable. You find a history that behaves like the real history of an ancient world, one recovered slowly from ruins, from stories passed down by people who were not there, and from records written by the winners. The trouble begins the moment you ask when something happened. Riot has been careful, almost stubbornly careful, about attaching hard dates to the events of Runeterra. Some moments in the world are fixed in stone, understood by everyone, and impossible to move. Others float loosely, placed only in relation to the events around them, described as coming before one thing and after another, without any number to hold them down. A large amount of the deep past exists as legend, told in the voices of the cultures that remember it, which means the same event can look very different depending on who is doing the remembering. That is the first thing worth settling clearly. There is a difference between confirmed order, estimated dates, and open contradiction, and these three categories sit side by side all through Runeterran history. Confirmed order means we know that one event came before another, even when we cannot say by how long. Estimated dates are the guesses, usually made by fans rather than by Riot, that try to pin ages and centuries onto a world that resists them. And contradictions are the places where two official stories simply disagree, where a champion biography written years ago no longer matches a cinematic or a novel or a television series released long after. Once you separate those three, the fog starts to lift. A world without perfect dates is not a world without history. It only means the history has to be rebuilt rather than read, assembled from the pieces that survive rather than copied from a master list that never existed. So that is what tonight is. Over the next stretch of quiet hours, the plan is to rebuild Runeterra's timeline from the ground up, moving from the cosmos that came before the world, through the creation of the planet itself, into the first civilizations, the rise and ruin of Shurima, the age of the Darkin, the catastrophes that scarred the land, the birth of the nations that stand today, and finally into the modern era and the deliberate reshaping of the whole story that Riot began in recent years. Along the way, the goal is honesty about what is solid, what is guessed, and what remains genuinely unresolved. The world of Runeterra is real and traceable in its broad shape. It is only in the fine detail, the exact years, and the precise order of the oldest events, that it stays beautifully, permanently uncertain. To rebuild a timeline, you first have to understand how time is even recorded in this world, and that is where a lot of the confusion starts. The honest position is that Runeterra has no shared universal calendar that every nation agrees on. There is no single year zero that a person in the far north and a person in the deep desert would both recognize. The closest thing to an official system is something called the Noxian calendar, and the very fact that it belongs to one empire rather than to the world tells you almost everything about how history works here. The Noxian calendar counts its years from the founding of Noxus, and it is the dating system that Riot's own sources tend to lean on when they reach for numbers at all. That sounds tidy until you notice the catch. The exact length of a Noxian year has never been revealed, which means it cannot be lined up cleanly against the calendar we use in our own world. A Noxian year could be close to one of ours, or it could be something else entirely, and without that conversion the numbers float free of any real anchor. Riot has left this deliberately open, and that is not an accident. It is a way of keeping the deep past flexible. There is a second reason the Noxian calendar sits at an odd angle to the truth. It is a Noxian record, written from the perspective of an empire that spent centuries swallowing smaller nations and spreading its own version of events into every corner of the world it touched. Noxus prides itself on carrying the torch of history, on being the keeper of the story, and an empire that keeps the story is an empire that shapes it. History written by the conqueror is rarely gentle with the conquered, and it is rarely complete about the things the conqueror never saw. So even the one semi-official calendar comes soaked in bias, favouring the events Noxus witnessed and dimming the ones it did not. That is only the record kept by a single power. Every other culture in Runeterra remembers time in its own way, and those ways do not agree. The tribes of the frozen north pass their history down as saga and song, tying events to the deeds of demigods rather than to any counted year. The spiritual traditions of the First Lands measure the world through the movement of spirits and the turning of seasons, treating some ages as sacred cycles rather than as straight lines. The people of the Great Desert once measured their days by the reign of god-emperors and the light of a fallen sun, and when that civilization collapsed, its careful records collapsed with it. Each of these cultures holds a piece of the truth, and each holds it in a shape that does not fit neatly beside the others. This brings us to the deepest divide in Runeterran history, the gap between ancient legend and written record. Some events are known because someone wrote them down, carved them, or preserved them in a form that survived. Far more events are known only as story, handed from mouth to mouth across generations until the edges wore smooth and the details drifted. A great catastrophe in the distant past destroyed an enormous amount of the world's written history, and when the records burned, whole ages slid out of memory and into myth. What we call the earliest history of Runeterra is often not history in the strict sense at all. It is folklore that has been believed for so long that it hardened into something people treat as fact. Now here is the part that trips up almost everyone who goes looking. If you search for a Runeterra timeline online, you will find something that looks far more precise and confident than anything Riot has ever published. You will find neat lists with numbers attached, events sorted into centuries, a clean march of dated moments from the beginning of the world to the present day. These community timelines are careful, dedicated, and genuinely useful, and the people who build them do extraordinary work. What matters is understanding what they actually are. They are reconstructions. They take the scattered hints that Riot has dropped, the vague phrases like many centuries ago or long before the Empire, and they translate those hints into estimated years so that everything can be placed in order. The precision is a tool for organizing the story, not a set of facts handed down from Riot itself. The largest and most respected of these fan timelines says so directly. It describes itself as unofficial, as something that should be treated as accurate and complete as possible, while never being mistaken for Riot's own word. The numbers you see in those charts, the specific years before and after the founding of Noxus, were in many cases invented by dedicated fans and outside wikis to make dates discussable at all, not declared by the people who own the world. Riot, for its part, tends to keep its years vague on purpose, giving figures only in rough hundreds or thousands, and only for the events that truly matter. Everything else is left loose, so that later stories have room to move. There is a further wrinkle worth understanding, which is that Riot's own approach to dates has changed over the life of the game. An older version of the world once used a very different calendar, tied to an institution that has since been written out of the story entirely, and that system was eventually abandoned along with the lore it belonged to. What this means in practice is that even the official dating has a history of its own, a record of the record, and pieces of the old system still surface in fan discussions today. The way Runeterra keeps time is not a fixed thing handed down once and for all. It is something that has itself been revised, which is a fitting introduction to a world whose entire history keeps being rewritten. There is a real lesson in this, and it is worth carrying through everything that follows. A reconstructed year system should never be treated as unquestionable canon. When you see a Runeterra timeline that tells you a certain war happened in a certain exact year, the safest response is quiet caution. That number is almost certainly a fan estimate built on top of a vague official hint. Useful for keeping the order straight, but not the same thing as a fact Riot has locked into place. The world does have a shape, and much of that shape is solid. The precise measurements laid over it are the part to hold lightly. With that understanding in hand, we can begin at the true beginning, in the vast dark that existed before Runeterra was ever a world at all. Long before there was a world called Runeterra, there was the cosmos, and the cosmos was not empty. The oldest layer of this history does not take place on a planet at all. It takes place in the vast dark between stars, in a celestial realm that existed before the physical world and continues to exist alongside it. This is the part of the timeline that has no dates whatsoever. Not even fan estimates worth trusting, because it happens on a scale where years lose their meaning. What we have instead are figures and forces, beings so old and so large that the rise and fall of empires would seem to them like the flicker of a single afternoon. At the center of the cosmic story stands Aurelion Sol, and to understand him is to understand how ancient this history reaches. Aurelion Sol is a celestial dragon of staggering power, a being who forged stars and set them burning across the emptiness. In the earliest age of the universe, his work was the lighting of the sky itself, the seeding of the dark with countless points of fire. Creation on that scale is difficult even to picture, a single creature drifting through the void and leaving suns behind him wherever he passed. He was a maker of worlds in the most literal sense, and the light of his labor still hangs over everything that came after. But power that great rarely stays free, and Aurelion Sol's story is a story of chains. The celestial beings of Mount Targon, the proud and ambitious powers known as the Aspects, coveted what he could do. Rather than match his strength, they bound it. Using an artifact of their own making, they trapped the great dragon and turned his gift into a tool, forcing him to forge stars for their glory rather than his own wonder. What had been an act of free creation became servitude. Aurelion Sol has carried that resentment across the long ages since, a cosmic maker reduced to a servant, waiting and scheming for the day he might reclaim the power that was stolen and be free of the crown that holds him. His presence in the timeline is a reminder that the oldest forces in Runeterra were shaped by ambition and betrayal long before any mortal drew breath. Those aspects who bound him belong to Targon, and Targon is one of the strangest points in the whole world, a place where the cosmic and the physical touch. Mount Targon stands as the meeting ground between Runeterra and the celestial realm, a peak so high that its summit brushes against the space where these greater beings dwell. The aspects are entities of pure celestial power, each embodying some vast idea, and they reach into the mortal world by descending into chosen hosts. A person who climbs to the summit and survives can become the vessel of one of these powers, carrying the strength and the will of something far older than themselves. This is how the influence of the stars enters the story of ordinary people. Not through distant light alone, but through living hosts who walk the world carrying a fragment of the heavens inside them. Beyond the aspects and beyond the Star Forger, there are older and darker things pressing against the edges of the world. The most troubling of these are the Watchers, beings that belong to a cold existence beyond Runeterra, in the empty spaces where warmth and life have no place. The Watchers are not creatures of the world. They come from outside it, drawn toward the light and life of Runeterra the way cold seeps toward heat, and their intent has always been to still that life, to freeze the world into the same lifeless silence they come from. In the deepest past they pressed inward, seeking a way through, and the story of how they were held back becomes one of the foundational events of the far north. For now it is enough to know that from the very beginning, the world had enemies waiting at its threshold, patient beyond mortal understanding, and that the threat from beyond is one of the oldest threads in the entire timeline. Not every cosmic power is a tyrant or a threat. Among the ancient forces there is Bard, a wanderer of a very different kind. Bard is a caretaker, a being who tends to the balance of the cosmos and moves between realms as easily as a traveler crosses a field. He is drawn to the material world by magic, gathering strange little companions called meeps as he goes, guarding the order of things against the forces that would unravel it. Where Aurelion Sol resents his chains and the Watchers hunger to end all warmth, Bard simply keeps the balance, an old and gentle power moving quietly through a universe full of louder ones. His existence points to something important about the cosmic layer of this history. It is not a single story with a single villain. The celestial realm those aspects belong to is not a place mortals can map, and its powers are best understood as living ideas rather than as people. Each aspect embodies some vast principle of the cosmos, the sun, the moon, the twilight between them, protection, war, and more. And when one of them descends into a mortal host, that principle walks the world in flesh. This is why the influence of the stars feels so personal in Runeterra rather than distant. A farmer or a warrior touched by an aspect does not merely receive power. They become, in part, the embodiment of a cosmic force far older than the ground beneath them. The oldest layer of the timeline, then, is not a list of dated events at all. It is a gathering of these enormous principles, Star Forger and Watcher and Wanderer and Aspect, moving through the dark long before there was a world for them to argue over. All of this raises the question of what came before the physical world at all, and the honest answer is that Runeterra's lore gestures toward it without ever fully drawing it. There was the celestial realm, home to the aspects and the light of the stars. There was the cold outside, home to the Watchers and things like them. There were wanderers like Bard and makers like Aurelion Sol moving through the dark. And somewhere in the midst of all this, a world began to take shape. A place where these enormous cosmic forces would eventually press down into something solid. Something with soil and oceans and living things. The moment the physical world formed is where the timeline begins to gather weight, where the abstract powers of the cosmos start leaving marks that mortals could one day dig up and study. That moment, the creation of Runeterra itself, is where the story turns from the sky to the ground. When the cosmic forces pressed down into something solid, Runeterra was born, and with it came a kind of magic that belonged to the world rather than to the stars. The formation of the world is not described as a single tidy event with a date beside it. It is described as an age, a long span in which the raw energies of creation settled into land and sea and sky, and in which the deepest powers of the planet took shape. These powers are the true foundation of everything that follows, and the most important of them are the world runes. The world runes are the primal magic of Runeterra given form, the concentrated forces that shaped the world in its earliest days. There are only a handful of them, and each one holds power on a scale that mortals were never meant to touch. A single world rune can raise mountains, drain oceans, or rewrite the nature of a place entirely. Together they represent the elemental building blocks of reality itself, the tools with which the world was made. This is not magic in the small sense of a spell or a charm. It is magic in the sense of geology, the kind of force that carves continents and sets the boundaries of what is possible. Everything that later goes wrong with magic in Runeterra traces back, in one way or another, to the existence of these runes and to the temptation they represent. Power that can shape a world can also unmake one, and the story of the world runes becomes, over time, a long warning about what happens when mortals reach for forces built to move planets. It is worth pausing on how few of these runes there are, because their scarcity is part of what makes them so dangerous. This is not a common magic that anyone might stumble upon. It is a small number of world-shaping forces, each one capable of catastrophe. And much of the later history of Runeterra can be read as a long struggle over who holds them and whether they should ever be used at all. The runes are the reason magic in this world is never a small matter. Behind every spell and every enchantment stands the memory of these primal powers, the forces that made the world and could just as easily break it. As the world settled, it filled with life, and much of that early life was bound up with magic and spirit. The primordial age of Runeterra was crowded with magical beings and spirits, entities woven from the raw energy of the young world. In some regions, the boundary between the physical world and the spirit realm was thin to the point of vanishing, and the two realms bled into one another freely. Spirits walked openly, elemental forces took living shape, and the early world hummed with a wildness that later ages would slowly tame or lose. From these beginnings came ancestral peoples tied to spirit magic, lineages whose descendants would carry that inheritance forward for thousands of years. The world was young and saturated with power, and the creatures born into it were creatures of that power, closer to the magic of creation than anything that lives in the settled world today. In the cold north, this primordial power took the form of demigods. The ancient Freljord remembers three figures above all others, three sisters whose names have echoed down every saga since. They are Avarosa, Cyrilda, and Lysandra, and they stand at the very root of the North's history. In the oldest telling, they were leaders and warriors of tremendous power, closer to the divine than to ordinary mortals, and they were bound together by both blood and purpose. Their great struggle was against the threat from beyond, the cold and patient enemy that had pressed at the edge of the world since before the world was fully made. The Watchers sought to enter and to still all life, and it was the three sisters and their people who stood against them in the far north. The way that struggle ended shaped the Freljord forever, and it is here that legend and betrayal become impossible to separate. In the story handed down through the north, the enemy from beyond was frozen, locked away in ice so cold and so absolute that it became something more than ice, a substance that would later be known as true ice. But the victory carried a wound inside it. One of the three sisters turned against the others, choosing a path that broke the bond between them, and that betrayal left scars that the North still carries in its blood and its rivalries to this day. The exact truth of what happened, who betrayed whom and why, survives only as legend, told and retold by peoples who each shaped it to fit their own memory. What remains solid is the shape of it. 3 demigod sisters, a war against an enemy from outside the world, a freezing that saved the North, and a betrayal that split it. The details shift depending on who is speaking, which is exactly what you would expect from an event this old. Alongside the demigods and the spirits, ordinary mortals were finding their footing. The first mortal civilizations rose during this primordial stretch. Small at first, scattered across a world still wild with magic. Humanity spread, settled, and began the slow work of building the things that outlast a single life. Shelters that became villages, villages that became something larger. These early peoples lived in a world where demigods walked and spirits were common, where the magic of creation was still close to the surface, and they built their first cultures in the shadow of powers far greater than themselves. Out of these scattered beginnings would eventually grow the great civilizations that dominate the recorded history of Runeterra. But in this age, they were only beginning, taking their first uncertain steps in a world that had barely finished forming. This is the point where honesty about the record matters most. Almost everything in this primordial age sits on the mythology side of the line, rather than the confirmed side. The formation of the world, the nature of the world runes, the deeds of the 3 sisters, the war against the Watchers, all of it comes down to us as story, rather than as documented fact. There is real substance underneath, a genuine sequence of ages that Riot treats as the true deep past of the world. But the fine detail is legend, and legend bends. When you hear these events described with confidence, remember that the confidence belongs to the tellers, not to any surviving record. The primordial age is real in its broad shape and uncertain in nearly all its particulars. And both of those things can be true at once. From this foundation of world runes, spirits, and demigods, the first true civilizations began to take form, and with them the history of Runeterra starts to sharpen from myth toward memory. As the primordial age gave way to something closer to true history, the first great civilizations of Runeterra began to take shape. And here the story finally grows firm enough to walk on. These early cultures are the ones whose names still matter, whose ruins still stand, and whose choices still shape the world thousands of years later. Each of them found a different answer to the same question, the question of how mortals should live in a world so thick with magic and so haunted by powers older than themselves. The Blessed Isles were among the brightest of these early lights. In the deep past, this archipelago was not the cursed and mist-shrouded ruin it would later become. It was a sanctuary of learning, a place where scholars, healers, and keepers of knowledge gathered to study the mysteries of the world in peace. At the heart of the Isles lay their greatest treasure. A hidden spring, known as the Waters of Life, waters said to hold the power to heal any wound, and to hold death itself at bay. The keepers of the Isles guarded this secret carefully, understanding that a power over life and death was not a thing to be shared freely. For a long age, the Blessed Isle stood as one of the most enlightened places in all of Runeterra, a refuge of wisdom set apart from the wars and hungers of the mainland. That brightness would one day be extinguished in a single catastrophe, but in this early era the Isles represented the very best of what mortal civilization could reach, knowledge gathered and protected, rather than hoarded and weaponized. Far to the east lay a land that remembered the primordial age more vividly than anywhere else. Ionia, often called the First Lands, was a place where the boundary between the physical world and the spirit realm had never fully closed. Magic flowed through Ionia the way rivers flow through ordinary country, and the people who settled there built their entire way of life around balance rather than conquest. Their spiritual traditions taught harmony with the spirits, respect for the natural order, and a patience that outsiders often mistook for weakness. Ionia was never a single unified state in the way an empire is unified. It was a scattering of provinces and communities, each following its own path, held together less by government than by a shared reverence for the living magic of their land. Among its people walked the Vastaya, beings descended from ancestral spirit magic, carrying the inheritance of the primordial world in their very forms. For long ages, Ionia knew peace, protected by its isolation and by the quiet strength of a people who had made their peace with the magic around them. Ionia's bond with the spirit world also left a living mark in its people, because among them walked the Vastaya, beings whose ancestry reached back to the spirit magic of the primordial age. Part human and part something older, the Vastaya carried the inheritance of the first lands in their very bodies. A reminder that in Ionia, the boundary between the mortal and the magical had always been more suggestion than wall. Their presence made the region unlike anywhere else, a land where the deep past had never fully receded, where the magic of creation still walked in living form. For as long as Ionia kept to itself, this heritage remained safe, woven quietly into the life of the provinces. In the frozen north, the legacy of the three sisters shaped everything that came after. Once the great enemy had been frozen away, the ancient Freljord did not settle into a single kingdom. It fractured, as the north always seems to fracture, into peoples and tribes who each remembered the sisters differently and honored different pieces of their legacy. The ideals of the sisters who had stood true were carried forward by those who valued unity and survival, while the darker path taken by the one who betrayed them left its own poisoned inheritance. That betrayer did not simply vanish into legend. Through terrible means, she prolonged her own existence far beyond any mortal span, hiding among her people, secretly bound to the very enemy the sisters had once fought, waiting and watching across the centuries. The Freljord that emerged from this age was a land of hard winters and long memories, its tribes divided by old grievances that reached all the way back to the founding betrayal. Its history preserved in saga rather than in ink. Hidden away from all of this was Ixtal, perhaps the most secretive of the early civilizations. Ixtal was a nation of elemental magic, its people masters of a discipline that let them command the raw forces of the natural world, the axioms of earth and fire and water and air. In the early ages, Ixtal's knowledge was among the most advanced in the world, and for a time it was connected to the broader currents of history rather than sealed away from them. But the Ixtali made a choice that set them apart from every other great power. Fearing that their magic would be stolen, corrupted, or turned against them, they withdrew, retreating into the depths of the jungle and hiding their greatest city from the outside world entirely. Isolation became their defining strategy, a decision to preserve their secrets by vanishing from the map rather than defending a place on it. While other civilizations rose and fell in the open, Ixtal simply stepped out of sight, waiting behind its veil of jungle and magic, its elemental mastery preserved but unknown to the wider world. High above the settled lands rose Targon, where the influence of the aspects pressed most directly into mortal affairs. At the base of the great mountain, hardy tribes made their home, and their entire culture came to revolve around the celestial powers whose presence they could feel above them. Some devoted themselves to the sun, others to the moon. And the ancient tension between those two devotions ran deep through Targon's history. Warriors trained their whole lives for the impossible climb to the summit, understanding that those who reached the top and survived might return as the host of an aspect, carrying a fragment of the heavens back down into the world. Targon was less a nation in the ordinary sense than a threshold, a place where mortals lived in constant nearness to cosmic power, where the line between a person and a god could be crossed by anyone willing to climb high enough. The aspects reached into the world through Targon, and so the early history of that mountain is really the history of how the celestial realm first touched ordinary human lives. That nearness to the heavens split Targon's people along a line that has never fully closed. Some gave their devotion to the sun, building an order around its light, its warmth, and its promise of unity under a single blazing truth. Others turned toward the moon, keeping to the shadows and the quieter wisdom of the night, and the two faiths came to regard one another with deep suspicion. This ancient division between sun and moon runs through Targon's whole story, a rivalry of belief rather than of borders, and it shaped the mountain's culture as surely as the climb itself. To live at the foot of Targon was to live inside a question about which light to follow, and that question has outlasted empires. Underneath all of these distinct civilizations ran the slow current of early human migration. People spread across the face of Runeterra, following coastlines and rivers, settling in valleys and deserts and forests, carrying their customs into new lands and adapting to whatever they found there. Some of these movements planted the seeds of nations that would not fully bloom for thousands of years. The scattering of humanity across the continents in this age set the stage for everything that followed, distributing peoples into the regions that would one day become the great powers of the modern world. These early settlers did not know they were laying foundations. They were simply looking for places to live, but the map they drew with their wandering feet is, in its rough outline, the map of Runeterra we still recognize. From these earliest civilizations, one would eventually rise higher than all the others, reaching for a power that touched the divine, and its story is the largest and most consequential chapter in the entire history of the world. Of all the civilizations that rose in the ancient world, none climbed higher than Shurima, and none fell further. The story of Shurima is the largest single chapter in Runeterra's history, a tale of an empire that reached for the power of the sun itself and paid for that reach with a catastrophe that still poisons the world. To understand almost anything about the deep past, from the origin of the Ascended to the first appearance of the Void, you have to understand what happened in the desert. Shurima began, as most great powers do, small and scattered. Across the vast deserts of the south, tribes and city-states carved out lives in a harsh and unforgiving land. And over generations, these separate peoples were drawn together into something larger than any of them could have been alone. The empire that grew from this union became the dominant power of its age, a civilization of gleaming cities, deep learning, and enormous ambition, rising out of the sand to command respect across the known world. Shurima's wealth and knowledge made it the envy of every neighbor, and its people believed, with the confidence of a rising power, that their empire was destined to endure forever. At the heart of Shurima's power stood one of the most important artifacts in all of Runeterra, the Sun Disk. This great construct, raised above the Empire's capital, was tied to celestial power, drawing down the strength of the sun and focusing it into a single sacred place. The Sun Disk was more than a monument. It was the engine of Shurima's greatness. And its most important function was the ritual it made possible, the ritual of ascension. Beneath the light of the disk, a mortal chosen as a champion of the Empire could be transformed into something far greater than human, lifted up into the ranks of the Ascended. The Ascended were the glory of Shurima, and they were unlike anything the world had seen. A mortal who underwent the ritual and survived was remade into a towering, demigod-like being of immense power, near immortal, often bearing the features of sacred desert animals. The wise Nasus took the form of a great jackal, a scholar and strategist of extraordinary intellect. His brother Renekton became a mighty crocodile, a warrior of ferocious strength and unbreakable loyalty. These were not the only ones. The ranks of the Ascended included the Empire's greatest heroes, each raised from mortal life into something closer to a god, and together they formed a host of guardians, the like of which Runeterra has never seen since. To be chosen for ascension was the highest honor Shurima could grant, and the Ascended were revered as the living proof of the Empire's favor with the heavens. The ritual that made them was never a gentle thing. Ascension asked a mortal to stand beneath the full-focused power of the sun and be utterly remade, and not everyone who attempted it emerged as a triumphant demigod. The transformation demanded a certain worthiness, and those found wanting could be destroyed or twisted by the very power meant to elevate them. This danger sat at the heart of Shurima's greatness, because the same ritual that produced its guardians could also produce ruin, and the Empire's mastery of it was never as complete or as safe as its confidence suggested. To reach for the power of the sun was always to gamble, and Shurima gambled again and again on the strength of the champions it chose. With such power at its command, Shurima expanded. The Empire spread its borders across enormous stretches of the world, absorbing neighboring lands, planting its cities and its culture far beyond the desert of its birth. Shurima became not merely a great power, but the great power, the center of the civilized world, a dominion so wide and so confident that it seemed to have no equal and no limit. This was the Golden Age, the height from which everything afterward would be measured. And it was precisely at this height, in the fullness of Shurima's confidence, that the seeds of its ruin were planted, not by an outside conqueror, but by one of its own subject nations. That nation was Icathia. Icathia had been brought under Shurima's rule, one of the many lands the Empire had absorbed in its expansion, and it chafed under that dominion. The people of Icathia longed for freedom, and their frustration curdled into a desperate resolve. Unable to match Shurima's ascended host through any ordinary means, the scholars and sorcerer lords of Icathia went looking for a weapon terrible enough to break the Empire's grip, and in their searching they uncovered something that should have stayed buried. Deep beneath the world, in places where the boundaries of reality wore thin, they found the Void. The Void is not a nation or an army. It is an emptiness that exists beneath and beyond the material world, a hungry nothingness that unmakes whatever it touches, and it had been sealed away from Runeterra for reasons the Icathians did not fully understand. In their desperation and their pride, they believed they could open the way to this power and bend it to their purpose, wielding it as a weapon against their Shuriman masters. They were catastrophically wrong. When Icathia broke the seal and rose in open rebellion, the Void did not serve them. It poured out into the world, and it consumed everything it reached, turning the rebellious nation into a nightmare of unmaking. Icathia, which had gambled everything on a weapon it could not control, became the first great victim of the very force it had unleashed. Shurima could not ignore what was happening. A wound had been torn in the world, and through it flowed something that threatened not just the Empire, but all life. And so the Empire sent its greatest weapons to close it. The ascended host marched on Icathia, and there began the war against the Void, one of the longest and most terrible conflicts in the history of the world. This was not a war of conquest or glory. It was a war of containment, a desperate struggle to hold back an enemy that could not truly be killed, only pushed back and sealed away. The Ascended, mighty as they were, found themselves fighting an enemy that felt no fear, knew no mercy, and returned again and again from an emptiness that had no bottom. The war ground on, and it took a fearful toll even on the immortal champions of Shurima. The cost of that war went far beyond the battlefield. The Ascended who survived the fighting did not come home whole. They had stared into the void, endured its horrors, watched their comrades unmade, and fought a foe that shattered the mind as surely as it shattered the body. The psychological destruction of the surviving Ascended is one of the darkest threads in Shurima's story. These were beings who had been raised up as near gods, confident in their power and their purpose, and the void broke that confidence in ways that would never fully heal. Some came away hollowed out, their sense of meaning stripped from them, their once noble purpose replaced by a bottomless emptiness of their own. The war was contained, the void pressed back and sealed as much as it could be, but the victory was hollow, and the wound it left in the souls of the survivors would fester into one of the great tragedies of the age to come. The horror the Ascended carried out of Icathia set the stage for what they would eventually become. The Void War also produced its own dark echoes of the Ascended. Because in the desperation of that long struggle, the sacred ritual was sometimes attempted outside its proper bounds, and the results were monstrous. Where a true Ascended rose as a being of terrible beauty and power, these failed and corrupted attempts produced twisted creatures, warped by the very forces they had reached for. The void itself, meanwhile, was never truly beaten. It was contained, pressed back behind seals and constant vigilance, but the emptiness that Icathia had unleashed remained beneath the world, patient and hungry, leaking through wherever the boundaries of reality grew thin. The war against it did not end so much as pause, and that pause has lasted, uneasily, ever since. While Shurima was still reeling from these deeper wounds, its final collapse came from within, from a betrayal, at the very summit of its power. In the later years of the Empire ruled the Emperor Azir, a man of great ambition, who dreamed of raising Shurima to heights even greater than it had known. Closest to Azir stood a man named Zerath, born a slave, who had risen through brilliance and cunning to become the Emperor's most trusted friend and advisor. But Zerath never forgot the chains he had been born into, and beneath his loyalty burned a hunger for power and a bitter resentment of the accident of birth that had made him a servant rather than a king. Azir resolved to do something no emperor had done before, to undergo the ritual of ascension himself, to become an ascended god emperor and lift Shurima to unmatched glory. At the moment of the ritual, standing beneath the sun disk as the power of the sun gathered to remake him, Azir was betrayed. Zerath seized the moment and turned the ritual's power to his own ends, and everything went catastrophically wrong. Azir was destroyed, undone in the instant of his greatest hope, and Zerath was transformed, though not into what he had imagined. He became a being of pure arcane energy, immense in power, but bound and imprisoned by the very magic he had stolen. A god trapped in chains of his own making. The sun disk's power was thrown into chaos, and the heart of the Empire failed. Shurima, the greatest civilization the world had known, crumbled in that moment. Its cities were swallowed by the sand, its glory buried, its people scattered into the desert tribes that would wander the ruins for thousands of years to come. The aftermath left its own bitter legacy. Renekton, ever loyal, fought to contain the transformed Zerath, and together with his brother Nasus, he sealed the treacherous being away. But in the sealing, Renekton was trapped alongside Zerath, imprisoned in the dark for age upon age, and across those long millennia the noble warrior's mind was slowly ground away by the void-touched madness of his prison and the endless closeness of his hated enemy. The wise Nasus was left to wander a fallen world, mourning an empire that had collapsed in a single afternoon of betrayal. Shurima's fall is one of the few events in the deep past that Riot treats as a genuine anchor, a moment the whole timeline can be oriented around, and yet even its exact placement relative to the age that followed remains a matter of careful reconstruction rather than certain record. What is certain is the shape of the tragedy. An empire that reached for the sun, a subject nation that reached for the void, and a betrayal at the summit that brought the whole magnificent structure crashing down into the sand, leaving behind broken gods and a wound in the world that had only been contained, never healed. And from those broken gods, the next age of horror was born. The fall of Shurima did not end the story of the Ascended. It transformed it into something far worse. With the empire that had created them lying in ruins and swallowed by the sand, the surviving Ascended found themselves without a purpose, without a home, and without the sense of meaning that had once given their enormous power a direction. These were beings already broken by the war against the void, hollowed out by horrors no mortal mind could hold. And now, the very civilization they had been raised to protect was gone. What followed was the Age of the Darkin, one of the darkest and most violent periods in the entire history of Runeterra. The Darkin were the Ascended who had lost themselves. Leaderless and purposeless, their noble origins curdled into something monstrous, they became warlords, turning the tremendous power that had once defended an empire toward conquest, cruelty, and slaughter. Without Shurima to serve, they served only themselves, carving out domains through sheer force, ruling through terror, and treating the mortal world as a thing to be used and discarded. The champions who had once been revered as the glory of civilization became its scourge, and the peoples of the world, who had no defense against beings of such power, could only suffer beneath them. Their fall deepened through the magic they came to rely on. The ascended forms of the Darkin were not meant to endure forever without the sustaining structures of the empire that made them, and to preserve their power and their existence, the Darkin turned to blood magic. Drawing strength from blood and death, feeding their fading power on slaughter, they bound themselves ever tighter to cruelty as a means of survival. Blood magic was not merely a weapon for them. It became a hunger, a need woven into their continued existence, and the more they used it, the further they fell from whatever nobility their mortal lives had once held. This was the true corruption of the Darkin, the moment their tragedy became monstrousness, their suffering transformed into an appetite for the suffering of others. The Darkin did not present a united front. Consumed by pride and hunger and the wreckage of their own minds, they warred not only against the mortal world, but against one another. The Age of the Darkin was an age of endless conflict, of these fallen gods turning their power against their own kind in struggles for dominance that shook the world. There was no Darkin empire, no single dark throne. There were only warlords, each a catastrophe in their own right, clashing across a broken world and leaving ruin wherever their battles carried them. A world that had trembled beneath a single fallen empire now suffered under a scattering of god-tyrants who could not even agree to share the misery they inflicted. Among these figures, some names rise above the rest. Aatrox stands as one of the most powerful and infamous of all the Darkin, a warlord of overwhelming destructive force whose very presence became a byword for war and ruin. Once a proud champion of the old order, Aatrox was consumed by a rage and a despair so total that his existence itself became a kind of curse, a being who brought destruction, not merely as a means to an end, but as the whole of his purpose. Another name that endures is Solani, remembered as the Blade Witch, and her place in the story is especially important. Solani was tied to the terrible blood magic that let the Darkin bind their essence into blades and bodies, a technique that made them far harder to truly destroy. Her use of that magic drew the direct attention of the celestial powers, and it was against her, and those like her, that the world finally began to fight back. The prisons that resulted still carry their occupants in the memory of the world. One Darkin rage was bound into a great blade, another into a bow that would one day find its way into distant hands, another into a cruel scythe that hungers for the will of whoever carries it, and one whose essence did not stay in a single object at all, but spread instead into a pack of desert hunters, a single mind shared across many bodies. Each of these weapons is a fallen god held in check, and each carries the same terrible patience, waiting for a wielder weak enough or desperate enough to open a door back into the world. The variety of their prisons was a small mercy, because it scattered the Darkin rather than leaving them gathered. But scattered gods are still gods, and the danger never truly left. That resistance came from Targon. The celestial powers of the Great Mountain recognized the Darkin for what they were, an existential threat not just to one nation, but to the balance of the world itself. And Targon possessed something the ordinary peoples of Runeterra did not: the strength to stand against fallen gods. The aspects and the warriors who carried their power intervened, and the war against the Darkin became one of the defining struggles of the age. This was not a war that could be won through simple force, because the Darkin had learned to cheat death. Slain in body, a Darkin's essence would endure, waiting to return, which meant that killing them in the ordinary sense accomplished nothing lasting. Targon needed a different answer, and eventually it found one. The answer was imprisonment rather than destruction. The Darkin could not be killed, but their essence could be bound, trapped inside the very weapons they had come to favor. One by one, the great Darkin warlords were defeated and sealed away inside living weapons, cursed blades and bows and scythes that held their raging consciousness captive. This was the great victory that finally ended the open age of the Darkin, and it is one of the most consequential events in the deep history of the world. The god tyrants who had terrorized Runeterra were silenced, locked into objects, their power contained but not extinguished. The world could breathe again, and the long nightmare of the Darkin warlords came to a close, at least on the surface. But sealing a thing is not the same as ending it, and the lasting consequences of the Darkin Age reach all the way into the present day. Those cursed weapons did not crumble to dust. They endured, scattered across the world, each one holding a trapped and furious god waiting for a chance to return. Any mortal who took up such a weapon risked far more than they knew, for the Darkin essence within could corrupt, dominate, and eventually consume its wielder, using a borrowed body to walk the world once more. This is how the horror of the ancient world leaks into the modern one. Aatrox, most fearsome of them all, eventually broke free of his prison and seized a mortal form, wearing a stolen body as he pursues his terrible purpose. Other Darkin stir within their weapons still, wrestling for control of whoever is foolish or desperate enough to wield them. The age of the Darkin ended thousands of years ago in the reckoning of the world, and yet it never truly ended at all. Because the beings at its heart were only imprisoned, never destroyed. Their captivity is one more piece of unfinished ancient business haunting the present, a reminder that in Runeterra, the deep past is never quite as buried as it seems. And while the Darkin raged and were sealed away, other catastrophes were gathering elsewhere in the world. Disasters that would reshape entire kingdoms and scar the land in ways still visible today. Between the fall of the ancient empires and the rise of the nations we know today lies a stretch of history full of catastrophe, and it is here that the timeline becomes hardest to put in strict order. 3 great disasters dominate this Middle Age: the rise of an undead conqueror, the ruin of a sanctuary of learning, and a series of wars fought with the raw magic that shaped the world. Riot has been careful never to lock these events into a rigid sequence relative to one another, and so the honest approach is to understand each on its own terms, weaving them together where their exact placement stays uncertain. The first of these disasters began with a mortal man named San Uzal. In an age of warlords, San Uzal rose above them all, a conqueror of ferocious ambition who carved out a vast dominion through sheer force of will and arms. He was among the greatest warriors of his time, a man who built an empire on the battlefield and who came to see death not as a natural end, but as the ultimate enemy. A thief that would one day steal everything he had won. Most conquerors make their peace with mortality. San Uzal refused. When death finally came for him, cut down despite all his power, he would not accept it, and his refusal became one of the most terrible acts of will in the history of the world. Through mastery of the magic of the dead, San Uzal returned, and the being that came back was no longer merely a man. He was Mordekaiser, a colossus of iron and undeath, a spirit of such power that death itself had become a tool in his hands rather than a cage. Where he had once ruled the living, now he ruled the living and the dead alike, binding the souls of the fallen to his will and raising an empire of undeath from a great fortress that would echo through history. That fortress, the immortal Bastion, would one day sit at the heart of a very different power. But in this age, it was the seat of a tyrant who had conquered death and turned it against the world. Mordekaiser's dominion was a nightmare made real, a kingdom where even dying offered no escape from his rule. Such a tyranny could not be ended by ordinary means, and in the end it was not strangers but his own closest servants who brought Mordekaiser down. His lieutenants, understanding that no army of the living could defeat a master of death on his own ground, turned his own knowledge against him. Using the very magic that sustained him, they banished his spirit into the death realm he had made his domain, imprisoning the conqueror in the darkness he had thought to command. Mordekaiser was contained, but like so many powers in Runeterra, he was not destroyed, and the death realm has never been able to hold something that hungry forever. His shadow lingers over the middle age of the world, a warning about the lengths to which a great will might go to defy the natural order, and about the ruin that follows when it succeeds. The second great disaster of this age destroyed one of the brightest places in the world, and it grew, of all things, from love. Far from the fortress of the undead conqueror stood the kingdom of Carnivore, a powerful and militaristic realm, and at its head sat a young king named Viego. Viego loved his queen, Isolde, with a devotion so total that it consumed everything else in him, and when tragedy struck her, that devotion became the doorway to catastrophe. Isolde was mortally wounded, and Viego, unable to bear the thought of losing her, refused to accept her death with the same fury that Mordekaiser had once refused his own. His desperation drove him toward the one place rumored to hold power over life and death, the Blessed Isles and their hidden waters of life. What happened when Viego brought his grief and his armies to the Blessed Isles is the single most consequential catastrophe of the Middle Age. In his desperate attempt to restore his lost queen, Viego unleashed a magical disaster of staggering scale, an event remembered ever after as the Ruination. The magic he set loose did not bring Isolde back. Instead, it swept across the Blessed Isles and killed everything, transforming the Sanctuary of Learning into a realm of death. The beautiful isles became the Shadow Isles, wreathed in a supernatural fog called the Black Mist that carries death wherever it drifts. The scholars and keepers who had made the isles a beacon of wisdom were twisted into undead wraiths, trapped between life and death, and Viego himself became the ruined king, a being of the mist consumed by an endless, maddened yearning for the wife he had destroyed everything to save. The consequences of the ruination rippled outward far beyond the isles themselves. The black mist that was born there did not stay put. It spread, reaching toward the mainland, carrying the horror of the Shadow Isles into the wider world and menacing the coasts nearest to it. A place that had once been the pride of civilized Runeterra became its most feared and cursed region, a source of undeath and dread that would trouble the world for the rest of its history. The transformation of the Blessed Isles into the Shadow Isles stands as one of the clearest anchor points in the Middle Age, an event whose effects are visible and undeniable. Even if the precise year it happened remains, like so much else, a matter of estimate rather than record. The third great disaster of this age was not a single event but a long agony, and it grew from the oldest and most dangerous power in the world runes. These primal forces, the very magic that had shaped Runeterra in its creation, were eventually discovered and seized by mortal mages who learned to wield their world-shaping power. What followed was the Rune Wars, a series of conflicts in which factions turned these reality-altering forces against one another as weapons. The devastation was beyond anything the world had known, because the world runes were never meant to be tools of war. They were the forces that raised mountains and carved seas, and when they were unleashed in battle, they reshaped the very land, laying waste to enormous stretches of the world and scarring Runeterra so deeply that the wounds never fully closed. The Rune Wars were global in their reach and catastrophic in their cost, and they left a mark on the world's memory as deep as any event in its history. So terrible was the destruction that magic itself came to be feared, blamed for the ruin that had nearly ended everything. Among those who understood the danger most clearly was the Archmage Ryze, who dedicated his existence to hunting down the scattered world runes and securing them, determined to keep such power out of mortal hands forever after seeing what it had done. The Rune Wars form one of the great dividing lines in Runeterra's history, the catastrophe that closed the ancient world and set the stage for the modern one. In their aftermath, exhausted and terrified peoples began to rebuild, and the choices they made in that rebuilding, some embracing magic and some rejecting it entirely, would give birth to the nations that define Runeterra today. It is with that founding of the modern world that the timeline finally begins to come into clearer focus. Out of the ashes of the ancient catastrophes rose the Runeterra that most people picture when they think of the world. A map of distinct nations, each shaped by the disasters that came before it and by the choices its founders made in response. This is the era where the timeline sharpens considerably. The nations of the modern world have clearer histories than the god empires of the deep past, and their founding stories fit together into something close to a coherent picture, even if the exact years still resist being pinned down. Demacia was born from fear of magic, and that fear defined everything about it. Its founders were refugees, people who had fled the devastation of the Rune Wars and carried with them a deep and lasting terror of the power that had nearly destroyed the world. Rather than embrace magic, they resolved to build a place where they would be safe from it, and they found their answer in a rare material called petricite, a substance able to dampen and absorb magical energy. Weaving petricite into the very architecture of their new kingdom, they created a stronghold where magic could be suppressed and controlled, a walled sanctuary of order raised in a defensible and isolated land. Demacia grew into a kingdom of law, honor, and rigid discipline, proud of its strength and deeply suspicious of the arcane. That founding fear never faded. It calcified into a way of life in which mages were feared and hidden, and the tension between Demacia's noble ideals and its harsh treatment of its own magical citizens would eventually crack the kingdom from within. But in its founding age, Demacia was simply what its refugees had wanted it to be, a fortress against a world that had shown them how terrible magic could be. Noxus took the opposite path, and it rose from the ruins of a nightmare. The Empire of Noxus grew up around the immortal Bastion, the very fortress that had once been the seat of the undead conqueror Mordekaiser, and something of that place's grim history seemed to seep into the empire that claimed it. Noxus became a power built on strength, an expansionist state that prized ability above all else, and made a genuine virtue of the idea that anyone, regardless of birth, could rise as far as their talent and will could carry them. This was its great strength and its great menace at once. An empire that rewards raw capability produces formidable people, and Noxus used them to conquer, absorbing neighboring lands one after another, spreading its dominion and its ruthless philosophy across vast territories. Ruled by a grand general at the summit of its brutal meritocracy, Noxus became the great expansionist threat of the modern age, the empire whose hunger for growth would eventually drive it to invade lands far beyond its borders. To the west, a very different kind of power was rising. One built not on conquest or fear, but on invention. Piltover became known as the City of Progress, a gleaming hub of trade, science, and innovation, where the brightest minds of the age gathered to push the boundaries of what technology could achieve. Beneath and around it lay Zorn, an undercity of industry and chemistry, crowded and polluted and full of the people whom Piltover's prosperity had left behind. The two were bound together, one shining above and one labouring below, their fortunes tangled by geography and history alike. It was here, in the meeting of ambition and ingenuity, that Hextech was born, the fusion of magic and machinery that would transform what technology could do. The origins of that breakthrough and the exact relationship between the twin cities are among the parts of Runeterra's history that Riot has reshaped most heavily in recent years, a point worth returning to later. What matters for the map is that Piltover and Zorn together became one of the world's great centers of power, not through armies, but through the relentless engine of progress. Along the treacherous seas grew Bilgewater, a port city unlike any other in the world. Built up around a scattering of islands where the ocean teemed with monstrous creatures, Bilgewater became a haven for those who lived beyond the reach of ordinary law. A lawless harbour of sailors, smugglers, sea hunters, and pirates. Its economy ran on the dangerous trade of hunting the great beasts of the deep, and on the endless traffic of goods that passed through a port where few questions were asked. Bilgewater answered to no king and no council, only to strength and cunning, its fortunes decided by the reaver captains, who fought for control of its docks and its markets. Its position carried a special peril, for it lay near the cursed Shadow Isles, close enough that the black mist sometimes reached its waters, binding this rough and busy port to the ancient horror of the ruination, in a way no other modern power had to endure. In the frozen north, the old legacy of the Three Sisters had settled into a patchwork of rival tribes. The modern Freljord was divided among peoples who each carried a different piece of that ancient inheritance. The Avarasan, remembering the sister who had sought to unite rather than divide, dreamed of drawing the scattered tribes together into a single people. The Winter's Claw embraced the harsh law of survival, holding that only strength and struggle could be trusted in so cruel a land. And the Frostguard, most secretive of all, guarded a terrible truth, for their true purpose was bound to the ancient enemy frozen at the edge of the world, watched over by the same betraying sister who had never truly died. The political shape of the modern Freljord was really the ancient war of the sisters still playing out, thousands of years later, in the rivalries of their heirs. Ionia, meanwhile, remained much as it had always been, at least for a while longer. The First Lands kept to their spiritual traditions, decentralized and peaceful, a scattering of provinces united by reverence for the living magic of their home rather than by any central throne. Ionia's isolation and its harmony had protected it for ages, and its people had little reason to expect that the wider world's hungers would ever reach them. That security was an illusion waiting to be shattered, but in the founding age of the modern nations, Ionia still stood as it long had, tranquil and inward-looking, unaware of the storm gathering beyond its shores. Far to the south, the once mighty Shurima had become a memory buried in sand. After the Empire's collapse, the desert reclaimed its cities, and the descendants of that great civilization were reduced to nomadic tribes wandering among the ruins of a glory they could barely imagine. The sun disk lay dormant, the ritual of ascension lost, the god-emperors gone. Shurima, after the Empire, was a land of scavengers and survivors, living atop the bones of the greatest power the world had ever known, waiting, though they did not know it, for a resurrection that lay far in their future. Together, these nations, the fearful fortress, the hungry empire, the twin cities of progress, the lawless port, the divided north, the peaceful first lands, and the fallen desert, formed the political map of modern Runeterra. The world had settled into a shape at last, and with that shape in place, history moved into its most recent and most turbulent chapter, the modern era, where the events that shape the world's present were set in motion. The modern era is where Runeterra's history stops being the study of ruins and becomes the story of events still unfolding. These are the conflicts that define the world as it stands now. The wars and upheavals and resurrections that Riot's stories return to again and again. And they follow one another closely enough that their order is far clearer than anything in the deep past. This is the recent history of the world, and it moves fast. It opened, for much of Runeterra, with the Noxian invasion of Ionia. Driven by its endless hunger for expansion, the Empire of Noxus turned its armies against the peaceful First Lands, and the war that followed shattered Ionia's long peace. Noxus expected a swift conquest against a decentralized and spiritual people. But Ionia did not fall easily, and the brutal, grinding conflict transformed both the invaders and the invaded. Among the Ionians, the war forged new leaders and hardened old ways of life, driving some toward vengeance and others toward a discipline they had never needed before. The invasion was eventually repelled, Ionia clawing back its freedom at a terrible cost. But the land that emerged from the war was not the same tranquil place it had been. The wounds of the invasion, the atrocities committed and the vengeance they inspired, disrupted the ancient balance of the First Lands and set in motion tensions that still trouble the region. The Ionian War also reshaped Noxus itself, because it was there that one of its most consequential figures began his rise. Jericho Swain, a Noxian general, suffered grievous loss in the campaign, and from that low point he began a climb that would end at the summit of the Empire. Swain seized power in Noxus, overthrowing the old order and replacing the rule of a single Grand General with a new structure of his own design, the Trepharics. This council enshrined the three values Noxus held most sacred: might, guile, and vision, dividing supreme authority among representatives of each so that no single tyrant's weakness could undo the empire. Swain's transformation of Noxian government marked a turning point in the modern era, reshaping the most aggressive power in the world from within and setting the terms of its ambitions for the years to come. While Noxus reordered itself, Demacia was tearing itself apart. The kingdom's ancient fear of magic, built into its very foundations, finally erupted into open crisis. At the center of it stood Silas, a mage who had been imprisoned by the Mage Seekers, the very institution Demacia used to hunt and control those born with magic. Silas escaped his captivity and became the spark of a mage rebellion, rallying the persecuted and the hidden against a kingdom that had treated them as threats to be caged. In the chaos and violence that followed, the reigning king was killed, and the proud fortress nation that had stood for order and law found its ideals collapsing into conflict. Damasia's mage rebellion exposed the rot beneath its noble self-image, and the kingdom was left fractured, forced to confront the cruelty woven into its founding fear. Far to the south, one of the most striking events of the modern age unfolded in the desert. Shurima, fallen for thousands of years, returned through the blood of a descendant of the imperial line. The ancient emperor Azir was resurrected at last, rising from the sand to reclaim the empire that betrayal had stolen from him. His return breathed new life into a land of scattered tribes and buried ruins, offering the possibility that the greatest civilization the world had ever known might rise again. But Azir's resurrection did not come alone. In the same upheaval, his ancient betrayer Zerath broke free of the prison that had held him since the Empire's fall, loosing a being of immense and hateful power back into the world. The rebirth of Shurima carried its old curse with it, the Emperor and the traitor returning together, their ancient conflict reawakened in the modern age. The most sweeping catastrophe of the modern era came from the ancient horror of the ruination itself. Viego, the ruined king, who had haunted the Shadow Isles since he destroyed the Blessed Isles in his grief, finally reawakened with full force and broke free of his cursed realm. In his endless, maddened quest to reclaim his lost queen, he unleashed the Black Mist across all of Runeterra, spreading the death and undeath of the Shadow Isles far beyond their shores in what amounted to a global ruination. The entire world stood in danger of being consumed by the mist. Against this threat rose the Sentinels of Light, a band of champions drawn from across Runeterra who fought to turn back the tide of undeath and stop Viego before his sorrow could drown the world. This event stands among the largest in the modern timeline, a moment when an ancient tragedy nearly became the ending of everything. As if the mist were not enough, the oldest enemy of all began to stir again. From the accumulated death and consciousness that had poured into the void over the ages, a new power emerged. Belveth, a being that styled herself the Empress of a remade world. Where the void had once been a mindless hunger, Belveth represented something more terrifying, a void with purpose and vision, intent on unmaking reality and rebuilding it entirely in her own image. Her emergence marked a dangerous escalation of the most ancient threat in the world, the same emptiness that had destroyed Icathia and broken the Ascended, now rising with a will and a design. The Void threat, which had haunted Runeterra since before the fall of Shurima, entered a new and more dangerous phase. What makes the modern era so turbulent is that these crises do not wait politely in line. They overlap. The ambitions of Noxus press outward at the same time that Demacia fractures from within, while the desert stirs with a reborn empire and its ancient traitor. The mist threatens the coasts, and the void gathers itself beneath everything. A person living in this age of Runeterra would feel the world tightening on several sides at once, old horrors and new powers surfacing together rather than in tidy succession. This crowding of catastrophes is part of why the modern timeline feels so alive and so precarious. A moment when many long threads of history are all being pulled taut at the same time. These events, and others alongside them, continue to push the world toward its present condition, and they do not stand still. The modern era is the living edge of Runeterra's history, the parts still being written, where each new story advances the world rather than merely describing its past. It is worth noting that Riot treats the great modern events, the ruination above all, as core history. Genuine pillars of what has happened in the world. But it has also openly acknowledged that different releases sometimes told inconsistent versions of these same events, that the story as presented in one place did not always match the story as presented in another. That admission points directly toward the strangest and most modern problem in Runeterra's entire timeline. The problem of a history that keeps being rewritten even as it is being told. This is the part that makes Runeterra's timeline different from the history of any real ancient civilization, and it is the reason a straightforward chronology has always been just out of reach. The problem is not only that the records are old and incomplete. The problem is that the records themselves keep changing, rewritten by the very people who created them, so that the history of the world is a moving target even in the present day. To understand why Runeterra's timeline feels so slippery, you have to understand that its keepers have revised it many times, and that the story of those revisions is a story of its own. Riot's approach to the lore of League of Legends has always been flexible, and it has become more so over the years. In the game's earliest days, the entire premise of the world was different, framed around an organizing institution and a cast of summoners, closer to a formal sport than to the sweeping mythic history that exists now. That framing was eventually swept away, replaced by a rebuilt version of the world, and champion backstories have been repeatedly rewritten across the game's long life. A character introduced with one history might, years later, be given a very different one, as the writers refined their vision of who that character truly was. This constant revision is the deep reason older champion biographies no longer fit together perfectly. They were written at different times, under different assumptions about the world, by a team whose understanding of Runeterra kept evolving, and the seams between those eras show. Reworks make this even more dramatic, because when Riot rebuilds a champion, it often rebuilds their place in history too. A rework is not just new abilities and new art, it frequently comes with a rewritten backstory that can move a character from one region to another, or change the historical events they were tied to, or alter the very nature of the powers they represent. When that happens, the ripples spread outward. A single champion's new history can touch the history of a whole region, undoing old connections and forging new ones, so that events which once seemed settled quietly shift beneath the surface. The world's past is not fixed in these cases. It is edited, one character at a time, and each edit can ripple through the surrounding lore. The problem grows because Runeterra's story is told across so many different kinds of media, and they do not always agree. The lore lives in the game itself, in cinematics, in written champion biographies, in tie-in novels, in spin-off video games, and now in television. Each of these is made by different teams, at different times, with different demands. And each tells its piece of the story in its own way. A detail established in a novel might not match a detail shown in a cinematic. A backstory written for the game might sit awkwardly beside the version dramatized on screen. With so many voices telling the same history, small contradictions become almost inevitable, and over the years they accumulated into a tangle that grew genuinely difficult for fans to sort out. Nowhere is this clearer than with Piltover and Zorn, because their history was reshaped by the arrival of the animated series Arcane. When Riot decided that the show would be part of the true canon of the world, it also decided that the origin of Hextech, as depicted in the series, would be the official origin going forward. That was a major change, because it meant the story of how magic and technology first fused in the Twin Cities was now anchored to the show's version of events rather than to whatever had been described before. Arcane reshaped the chronology of Piltover and Zorn, establishing the timeline of their most important developments in a way that older material had to bend around. Other characters connected to those cities had their origins adjusted to fit the new canonical framework, their histories quietly revised so that the world would hold together around the show. The clearest example of how these ripples spread is the rewritten history of the Bracken and their most famous member, the Crystal Scorpion. In the older telling, the Bracken were ancient beings tied to Shurima, and their crystals were bound up with the origins of Hextech, the crystalline power source that helped drive the Twin Cities' technology. That connection linked a desert creature directly to the industrial magic of Piltover and Zorn. But once Arcane's version of Hextech became the canonical origin, the old crystal-based backstory no longer fit. So when the Crystal Scorpion was reworked, his history was rewritten with it. The Bracken were reimagined as ancestral elemental beings, tied now to the hidden elemental nation rather than to Shurima, masters of the raw magic of the earth rather than sources of Hextech crystals. His crystals, once central to his identity and to the origin of an entire technology, were written out. This single rework decoupled an ancient creature from the modern story of Hextech, a neat illustration of how changing one thread forces the rewriting of another, and of how a region's deep history can be reshaped to keep the whole story consistent. All of this produces the strangest feature of Runeterra's timeline, the problem of simultaneous but inconsistent versions. At any given moment, multiple accounts of the same event may exist side by side, published and official, yet not quite in agreement with one another. The great modern catastrophe of the Ruination and the War of the Sentinels is a clear case. That story was told across more than one product, appearing in an in-game event, in a spin-off video game, and in a novel, and the different tellings did not always line up. Riot itself has acknowledged that having multiple versions of that story made it genuinely unclear which details were meant to be definitive. Which version of events fans should treat as the true one. When the creators themselves cannot always say which account is canonical, the difficulty of building a clean timeline becomes obvious. Faced with this growing tangle, Riot made a public commitment to do something about it. In a developer update shared in 2023, the head of the studio's creative direction explained that the goal going forward would be to make all new storytelling part of one shared canon, rather than the jumble of similar but inconsistent experiences that had accumulated over the years. The aim was to iron out contradictions where possible, to tie the many threads of the world together, and to ensure that the essence of each character and each major event stayed consistent across everything the studio produced. This effort was described as a gradual process rather than an overnight fix, an ongoing labor of weaving the sprawling universe into something coherent. It was in the course of this same shift that Arcane was confirmed as fully canon, folded into the single, unified story of the world alongside the game itself. The honest takeaway from all of this is a subtle one, and it shapes how the whole timeline should be read. Many of Runeterra's stories are true in their broad strokes, even when their dates and details change. The rise and fall of Shurima, the ruination of the Blessed Isles, the age of the Darkin, these great events endure through every revision, treated as real pillars of the world's history. What shifts underneath them is the finer detail, the exact origins of a given character, the precise mechanics of a certain power, the specific ordering of events whose broad shape stays the same. A revision rarely erases the mountain. It redraws the paths up its slopes. And so the wise way to hold Runeterra's history is to trust the large shapes while staying gentle with the particulars, knowing that the particulars are exactly the things most likely to be rewritten in the next chapter. With that understanding, we can finally return to the question we started with and give it the honest answer it deserves. So does Runeterra have a timeline? After walking the whole length of it, from the cold cosmos before the world to the living edge of the present day, the answer is yes. But it is a particular and honest kind of yes, one that needs to be said carefully, to be said truthfully. Runeterra has a timeline in the way an ancient world has a timeline, which is to say a real one, a traceable one, and a permanently incomplete one. What the world clearly possesses is a general sequence of ages, and that sequence is solid. There was a cosmic era before the physical world. There was the creation of Runeterra and its primordial age of world runes and demigods. There were the first great civilizations, the towering Ryze and ruin of Shurima, the horror of the Darkin, the catastrophes of the Middle Age, the founding of the modern nations, and the turbulent present. That order holds. You can walk it from beginning to end without getting lost, and each age flows into the next in a way that makes sense. The broad shape of the history is one of the most reliable things about the entire world. Within that sequence stand several strongly established anchor events, moments so important and so firmly placed that the whole timeline can be oriented around them. The fall of Shurima is one, the ruination of the Blessed Isles is another, the sealing of the Darkin, the Rune Wars, the founding of the great nations, the modern upheavals like the invasion of Ionia and the return of Viego. These are the fixed points. The events that everyone agrees happened and that everything else is measured against. They are the load-bearing beams of the world's history, and they do not move. But between and around those anchors lie a great many events with only approximate placement, known to have happened before one thing and after another, yet never given a firm date. This is where the timeline turns soft. The deep past especially exists as a web of relative positions rather than fixed years, a sense of order without a sense of exact time. And underneath all of it runs the simple fact that Runeterra has no completely reliable universal calendar. The one semi-official system counts from the founding of a single empire, uses a year whose true length has never been revealed, and comes filtered through the biases of the conquerors who keep it. There is no clean world-spanning measure of time that every corner of Runeterra shares. Layered on top of these natural gaps are the contradictions created by revision and by telling the story across so many kinds of media. Champion histories rewritten over the years, reworks that move characters and reshape regions, novels and games and cinematics and television that do not always agree. All of it produces a history that sometimes contradicts itself, holding more than one version of the same event at once. Riot has openly recognized this, and has committed to weaving the world into a more consistent whole, a gradual effort to iron out the tangles, but the tangles are real, and some of them will take a long time to smooth. And through it all, the story keeps moving. Runeterra has a present-day storyline that continues to advance. New events added to the record even as old ones are revised, a history still being written rather than one long since finished. Put all of that together, and a clear picture emerges of what kind of timeline this really is. Runeterra's history resembles the history of an ancient world reconstructed from ruins, from legends, and from competing records. It is real and traceable in its broad sweep, anchored by events that cannot be doubted, ordered into ages that flow naturally one into the next. And yet it is never perfectly complete, full of gaps where the dates should be, softened by myth in its oldest reaches, and revised in its details by the hands that keep telling it. That is not a flaw in the world. It is the very thing that makes Runeterra feel like a place with genuine history rather than a neatly dated fiction. A real ancient past is always a little uncertain, always partly legend, always missing pieces that the centuries wore away. Runeterra has exactly that kind of past, a history you can trace and trust in its shape while holding its finer details gently, knowing the world is old, its records imperfect, and its story still unfolding. The timeline is there. It simply asks to be reconstructed rather than read, and in that reconstruction lies the quiet pleasure of piecing together a world.